Welcome to LOA Today. I'm Walt Thiessen.
I've been doing this podcast since September of 2012, and boy, are my lips tired.
This is your daily dose of happy. We are so happy you decided to join us today. And Jody Lynn can't join us today. She's actually, believe it or not, listeners, you know that she and her husband live on a farm in Alberta, Canada, and they are doing sleigh rides. They like to do this time of year, every year, and they're giving sleigh rides to local people who want to go out and have a little fun riding around in the great outdoors. So she will be joining us next week. But we are not bereft. We are not deprived, because I do have a special guest joining me today. His name is Max Ivey. He bills himself as the blind blogger, and you will find out very shortly why, because he is all about something that most of us, those of us who are sighted people, don't think about. We don't really think about accessibility in a lot of areas of life. I think more and more people are aware now because of, like handicap park spaces and things like that. They're a little bit more aware of the out in the world accessibility issues than they were before. But I don't think most people think about it from an internet perspective. And yet, as somebody who, previous life developed and designed websites, I can tell you it's very, very important when you're a web developer to do exactly that, to make every element on a page accessible, so that someone who is reading the page, reading in quotations, using software that tells them this is what you're seeing next, this is what this is saying, this is a picture of something. When you have that kind of stuff in there built into the code, it makes all the difference in the world for someone who lacks sight or perhaps lacks hearing or whatever. But the point is, it makes it easier for everybody to participate, not just people who are sighted. But I'm going to learn a whole lot more about this, as I'm sure you will as well, from our guests. So Max, I'm going to bring you on and say, first of all, welcome. How you doing today?
Well, thank you. I'm doing great. I appreciate you having me on the podcast. And I used to try to help a gentleman from Alberta who had some rides for sale once upon a time. And it's nice to hear they are sledding. Let me go close the door. I'm sorry.
Yeah, that's all right. No problem. We were both, actually, before we got started, we were both talking about issues offside. I had Joy was trying to get my attention. He wanted to go outside. He's going to be out for the full hour, so that's going to be really interesting to see how that plays out. So Max getting up to check the door, that's no big deal either. So he's coming back into his chair, getting himself all set up. And here he is.
Well,
okay.
I apologize for that. It turns out
that's all right.
One of the things we deal with is my younger brother is hearing impaired, whether he admits it or not, and he tends to shout when he's on the phone. So,
okay. All right.
I didn't anticipate that happening. So, but yeah, like I say, I used to have a client when I sold rides for people on the internet up in Alberta, and this time of year they're usually sleigh riding for necessity, not for entertainment.
Yeah, right. This is true. Although from what I understand from Jody Lynn, they don't actually have snow on the ground, so they're going to use wheeled wagons this time around. But give it another month or so, they'll have plenty to play with, I'm sure.
I'm sure they'll still enjoy being out in the country. So I am almost totally blind from retinitis pigmentosa. My name is Maxwell Ivey. I'm known around the world as the blind blogger. I grew up in a family of carnival owners in East Texas. I also grew up knowing eventually I would lose most, if not all, my vision to RP. But thanks to a supportive family, teachers, scoutmasters, I eventually graduated from traditional high school and college. I'm one of the few blind Eagle Scouts. I was lucky enough to be part of the family's carnival business for about 15 years before my dad's death caused the closure of our small show. And then after he died, I was kind of at loose ends for several years, and eventually I started a website called the Midway Marketplace, where I help people sell used rides and games. And this was 2007, so I had to figure out how to get online. And at least in the beginning, that meant teaching myself how to code HTML, which is something most of y'all don't have to deal with. As a website developer yourself, I'm sure you can just imagine how challenging it was to manage HTML with a screen reader.
Oh, God. I'm not sure I can imagine, because I know how hard it is to do when you're sighted. I can't imagine coding without sight. That baffles me.
Right. Well, the most important thing to remember with HTML is that symmetry will save your life. And Also, backing up everything before you make major changes will save your life.
Yes, right. Exactly. That's always true for any programmer.
Because if after 15 or 30 minutes you haven't figured out what you did wrong, you can just go back to the previous version and start over. Kind of like hitting a reset button on a video game sometimes. But yeah, I still have nightmares sometimes about less than's and greater than signs, and what did I miss? What is, and of course, on top of it, at one time, you couldn't even use dashes at one time you couldn't even use spaces or special characters in
URLs. Yeah.
URLs. I mean, sometimes you would forget, thinking a lot of times that was what it ended up being. It ended up being I had a space instead of a dash or something like that.
Yeah.
The funny thing is when I first started adding images, embedding them in pages, I had no way to edit the images. My brother would say, okay, Max, this is the best image. This is the second best. This is the third best. And if they were different size images, I would put them on the website. So sometimes if I messed up the HTML code, I'd have different shaped black holes on my website homepage or on one of the other pages, because that's what happens if the image doesn't display. So,
right.
But I also had to recruit clients and set fees and write copy, and I started a blog. And so people said, Max, we're really impressed with all the challenging things you do. You just seem to do the next thing that you have to with joy. So they encouraged me to start start sharing more about what it's like to be a blind entrepreneur. And so I started the second website. You mentioned I go by or call myself the blind blogger. In fact, the people on the internet called me the blind blogger. I just decided to accept it and run with it.
Oh, okay.
When I needed a domain name, deciding that I wanted a separate website for my work as a writer and the other things I'd be doing, I asked people in my LinkedIn and Facebook groups, I said, what should I call myself? And they said, well, we've been calling you the blind blogger for a couple of years now, so you'd be crazy to call yourself anything other than that. And I'm only crazy about 1 out of 7 days. I said, sure, let's do that. And theblindblogger.com was taken, so we went with theblindblogger.net, and from there I have written 4 books, 2 of them award winners. I've traveled the country solo, usually on very tight budgets. I have been on hundreds of podcasts, taught people to be guests, booked people on shows, and eventually started my own podcast called What's Your Excuse?, where I interview people who have overcome adversity or thrived in spite of life circumstances. I'm about to start a second podcast called The Adversity Advantage, where I plan to spotlight business leaders and other thought leaders who have embraced accessibility and inclusion to their positive benefit. So that's the future. I eventually faced my fear of singing as part of starting to record some videos for my first website. I now write songs and sing, as you know, from before we started recording.
Right.
I'm trying to think. I have become an accessibility advisor mainly because I've been doing the work for 15 years, and finally people came along and said, Max, you are an expert on this, whether you realize it or not. You need to start making a living doing it. So a year and a half, I was invited to contribute articles for AudioEye.com, and since then I've been asked to write for PHP Architect magazine and most recently Reviewed magazine, which is part of the USA Today family. And I'm continuing to branch out and write on accessibility for other publications. So that's happened. I've done public speaking and consulting. And, me and you, we met through a website called Podmatch, correct?
Right.
Okay. Podmatch is owned by my friend and mentor, Alex Sanfilippo. And I was blessed to be the one invited to advise him on how to make the site accessible for people with disabilities.
Oh, cool. Cool.
So yeah, well, when you work with somebody like Alex and you get the chance to work for him, you got to tell everybody about that, So
well, Alex is a cool guy, and Podmatch is a very cool site. He and his wife they're doing tremendous stuff there. It's really cool.
Yeah, and especially when you consider that not only is it a site that matches hosts and guests, not only is it a site that pays hosts when they interview a guest from the platform, but it's also a site where you have a guy who's been a podcaster for a long time, who puts himself in the place of the podcast hosts and guests and thinks, what can I do to make their lives easier? And so he's added the podcast flow that helps hosts streamline their process and, take less time to create new episodes. I just recently discovered this cool feature on Podmatch. If a host or a guest no shows, it gets written down somewhere. And if they no show enough times, the next time somebody visits their profile, it'll put up a reliability warning, and it'll tell you what percentage of times a host or a guest has failed to show up for a recording. Now, that doesn't seem like something that would happen very often, but if it does, wouldn't you love to know that before you book somebody? So that's
absolutely, yeah. And you're right. It doesn't happen very often. I think probably in the last year it's happened twice, and we've had guests on every single time that we do a show, which is at first part of the year was 5 days a week, and now it's 3 days a week. So I mean, there's quite a few coming through there. So it's certainly less than 1%. But you're absolutely right. I mean, if you know in advance that that's the kind of person you're dealing with, you say next.
I did it just this week. I found this show and I was thinking I could go on that show. It sounds like we'd have a good time. And I go to click it and it says this person's reliability has failed to show up 22% of the time. I'm like, that's over 1 out of 5. That's not something I want to do. So Alex is great people. The website is amazing. Being able to share all the stuff I've learned about accessibility and inclusion over the last 15 years with somebody like Alex is wonderful. And also, to have my first paying client and be able to begin a journey, if not, like maybe the 6th or 7th journey in my lifetime. So.
And that first paying client, no matter what kind of business you have, that's a big deal. I don't care what you're doing. That first one, everything starts to get real when you have that first client.
Until you have that first client, everything else you do is usually from the point of view of lack, fear, stress. It's like,
well, it can be also afterward, but you're right.
That's so true. But, until you sign that first client, it's always, is this going to work out? Am I fooling myself? Are my friends and family right that I should quit this foolishness and go get a traditional job? You have all those thoughts until you get paid. So, and in fact, more than once in my life, I have 2 younger brothers, Patrick, who I live with here in Conroe, who I mentioned earlier, and Michael, who's in Florida. Well, my brother Michael has had a traditional job in trucking in Florida for years. And I would say at least twice in the last 10 years, he has told me, when are you going to get a real job? So, I mean, I love him and all, but I just keep thinking, one, I'm 57 years old. My body has been abused by being in the carnival business for half my life. And I don't really want to have to drag my butt into an office and back home again every day and spend a certain number of hours sitting at a desk when I know the effects that will have on me. So I enjoy what I'm doing. I get to have great conversations. I get to share knowledge, experience, and ideas with people that benefit from it. I get to do most of this from my house and basically only travel when I want to. And I enjoy traveling, but I have a different point of view when it comes to traveling. And I try to share this with other creative people. Most creative types, speakers, authors, musicians, when they go on a trip, their goal is to cram as much stuff into each day that has to do with their business as possible. And then they usually come home sick, tired, frustrated with the mindset of, I don't ever want to have to do this again. Well, my approach is if I'm going somewhere, I might spend 1 or 2 days working, but I'm going to spend at least one day eating somewhere other than the hotel, visiting somewhere other than whatever I can get to across the street from the hotel. So I advise authors and people who have to travel for their work, build in mental health time for yourself, because
absolutely, yeah.
It doesn't matter what you're doing for a profession. If it gets to the point that your work is making you sick, you are doing it wrong. And far too many creative entrepreneurs are doing it wrong.
And not just when you're traveling. I mean, to me, I think it's a day-to-day thing. Every single day, you need to build that balance in. Because if you don't, you can work yourself to death. And I know that from experience.
Yeah, that's why I tell people that I love to read, and I read about half self-help and about half fiction, because sometimes the brain just wants a cheeseburger or a Snickers bar.
Yeah.
It doesn't want a salad,
Right.
and, also, for me, singing and spending some time, usually watching television with the family, are things I do. One of the things that used to break up my day quite a bit, and it came to mind because you mentioned your cat before we went live here, is I used to have this crazy white dog named Penny, and she was great at keeping me from working myself to death, because
Good.
she would always show up, and her attitude was, Max, there are squirrels outside who I'm not chasing, and you need to come open the door, and you need to put down that foolish laptop and pay attention to me. And so I tell people our pets are great mindfulness teachers, because they have no idea of stress of yesterday or tomorrow. Dogs and cats, they basically think, what do I feel like doing? And then they do it.
That's right. That's true. That's absolutely true. In fact, interesting you mentioned that, because with my cat is a rescue. He has a female name, and so I sometimes fall into the trap of female. His name is Joy, but he's a he. In the time that I've had him, I used to be married. The marriage broke up last year. She took one cat, I took the other one. And the one that she took was an indoor cat, because she had a genetically deformed front paw. So she needed to stay inside where it was safe. He was outdoors 24/7. When we split and went our separate ways, he was no longer an outdoor cat, partly because I was living in a new place and he didn't know the neighborhood. And partly, I realized that part of it was that he had never felt comfortable in his own home, because she owned the home from his perspective. She was the dominant cat inside the house. So he, since then, has gotten used to the idea of being the inside cat, the indoor cat, to the point where now he likes to drive me crazy. He'll give me the signals like he did before the show. I want to go outside. I want to go outside. And then an hour later, all of a sudden he wants to come in. Whereas before he would have been out like all day, all night, unless it was bitter cold outside. And even then I would have trouble getting him inside. So it's an entirely different behavior pattern. And I mentioned that because, like you said, before we got started, we were talking about the cat because he wanted to go outside. He's currently sitting outside the patio. I have a little camera out there. He's sitting on the patio waiting for me to let him in. Like, okay, I've been out here for 17 minutes. Why haven't you opened the door?
Yeah. The pets will teach us important lessons if we will pay attention to them.
They do indeed. It's really something.
Yeah. But one thing that will probably make you feel better about your cat's new behavior is cats that are outside cats live less than 2 years on average. Cats that are inside most of the time can live up to 20 years.
And he's doing really well, because I know for a fact he's at least 11 years old. I think because he's a rescue, I don't know his exact age, but I have reason to believe he's 14 to 15 years old. So he's lived pretty long being an outdoor cat. So I'm really grateful that he's been able to do that. And he's now getting to the point where it's probably better if he's in most of the time. So it's all working out. These things work out for the best, I think, in the long run.
Well, that's the way you have to look at them, because a lot of times we don't really know what is going on in the world as it's happening. It's only after things are over and done with that you can look and go, well, I should have saw that coming. I should have realized this was going to happen. One of my favorite authors, Tom Clancy, he passed away a few years ago, and
Sure.
He used to write these long, complicated plot lines in his books. And I once told somebody, reading a Tom Clancy book is like watching a master of jigsaw puzzles put a puzzle together a piece at a time, but they can put every piece out without the box, without the other pieces. And it's only when they've put every single piece, when they put that last piece down, that you can go, oh, that was the point of the story. And
right.
And that's the way it is a lot of times when we're in the middle of the river, when we're in the middle of trying to accomplish something, we may not see these other things that are going on, or we may not realize them until, like I say, the cumulative effect. When I was growing up, one of the things that used to be really common on television was time-lapse photography. They would take dozens, if not hundreds of pictures, and then they would play them really fast. So you could see a tree grow from a seed to a tall tree in like 5 minutes or something.
Right.
And I think sometimes that's the way our lives are. We don't see all those little bitty things that are happening until, wow, here you are.
That's really true. Yeah. And we go through a lot of life experiences along the way. That's actually a theme that plays out a lot here on the program, because with all the guests coming through, it's a very common, thread, a thread theme for someone to come on talking about how, they had a certain life and then they had some sort of traumatic thing happen, or maybe they had a traumatic early life. It could be either way, but they went through some sort of trauma, what they often call a dark night of the soul. And then they come out the other side and some tools help them when they were doing that. And so they start promoting those tools and they turn it into a career. And that's what leads them to be onto the podcast. So it's a very common theme. One thing that comes out of that I find to be really fascinating, and I want to find out if it's true for you too, given what you've been dealing with impaired eyesight and with, your desire to help promote accessibility. I find that people who go through difficult stuff, they would not necessarily want to repeat it. In fact, most cases, they don't ever want to repeat it, but it's the most valuable thing that ever happened to them, that they got more out of it than almost anything else. I was wondering, is that really true for somebody who has a sight impairment?
Well, I think it can be. And one thing that I have personally noticed from my own experience and also from being a podcast host myself is there seems to be a switch. And I don't know what causes it to go to the on or the off position, but there are many people who have a physical disability that have the related adversity who become amazing people, or who become ordinary everyday people that aren't affected too severely by their disability. But then there's that other group of people that the disability pretty much crushes their soul and their spirit. Right. And they are never the same person and never able to recover from it and live a normal life or an extraordinary life. And I, have no idea why that happens, but would you agree with me? There does seem to be a split. Some people have what's called the adversity advantage, and some people, the adversity is just too much for them.
I totally agree. I can think of many examples in many different areas of life. We often discuss, why it is that people, we call it being stuck in something. That's one example of how you can get stuck in something. Why do people get stuck? Sometimes it has to do with a victim mentality. Sometimes it has to do with just having a pattern play out over and over again. So it becomes familiar, it becomes what they call a comfort zone. There are a lot of different ways that it can play out, but it is kind of a mystery. I'm with you. I don't really know what flips the switch. The closest I've been able to come to an answer, and this comes mainly from one of my co-hosts, Joel Elston, who has had an amazing life of trials and tribulations and has turned it into something amazing, in the long run. But, he went through all kinds of crazy crap. What he's basically convinced me is the difference between the person who stays stuck and the person who doesn't stay stuck is the person who doesn't stay stuck takes action of some kind. And
I love that.
It doesn't even matter what the action is. You just the act of taking action shakes things up, and you start seeing things differently. You start doing things differently. You start feeling differently, and then different things start to happen. But when you don't take action, then you stay in that stuck space.
Well, I love that. That agrees with basically a topic that I have spoken on many times, where I talk about life as a river overcoming adversity by continuing to move forward. And as you say, it really doesn't matter what the action is. Some days the action is just putting your shoes on, or just sitting up in a vertical position, depending on how far down your life is taking you. In my case, I think there are two things that work. One, I was raised in a family of carnival owners, a family of people who did things that were challenging, who rarely had all the money, resources, or time that they wanted, but they knew that the world that they worked in would care nothing for their struggles. So the only thing that carnival folk care about, and the only thing that the customers care about, is, are you open on Thursday or Friday night?
Yeah, right.
Can they buy a cotton candy or a funnel cake? And
there you go.
Can they ride the Ferris wheel or the Tilt-A-Whirl? And can they try to win a stuffed animal? That's what they care about. And they could care less if you've got 2 trucks on the side of the road and a grandchild in the hospital. They want to know, why aren't you open? So it teaches you adaptability and creative problem solving. And something my dad used to say quite often, there were many times that me and him would have to go back after a ride or a game while the rest of the family was setting things up and getting ready to open. And we would make it back to the lot, and people would ask my dad, they would go, well, how did y'all do that? You didn't have a winch or a hoist. You didn't have the lug wrench or the jack. How did y'all do that? And my dad would always just grin at him and he'd go, what, did we have a choice?
Yeah, exactly.
One of my favorite stories ever. Me and him had to go back to Shreveport, Louisiana after a hurricane or tropical storm canceled a festival. It rained so much that even some of the National Guard vehicles had to stay there a week or two before they could be driven or towed out because the land was just a bog. And those vehicles are supposed to be able to manage during wartime situations, and they were stuck there on the lot just right next to a couple of our rides. Me and him went back with 4 2-foot by 10-foot pieces of plywood and backed our truck down to where the rides were. We physically disassembled one of the rides and loaded it on the other trailer piece by piece, including having to lift some of the ride cars above our heads.
Oh my God!
To set them on a deck of the trailer, and then we hooked up to the truck and we went back out the same way, 12 feet at a time. We rolled to the end of the first 2 pieces of plywood, then we moved the other 2 and roll again. And we had over 300 feet of ground to navigate just to get back there and get out again. But those are the kind of things he would be like, there has to be some way we can do this. So I think that helps me a lot. I personally credit my vision loss because I lost my vision gradually over a long period of time. And that means that on a regular basis, sometimes even daily, you have to adjust to what your new level of vision is and how you're going to, say, for example, perform your schoolwork or participate in a business while your vision is changing. So I think that helped a lot. But I do agree with you. A lot of times it is just taking some sort of action. And, I mentioned having to teach myself to code HTML, but the first thing I did when I realized that I needed to have something to do, I couldn't just keep hanging out in my mom and brother's house trailer and let them support us by working a food business on the weekends. The first thing I did was file for a domain name. And I had no idea what I was going to do as far as building a website or whether or not people would even want me to sell their used equipment. But that was the first thing. And then after I filed for the domain name, I started asking a bunch of questions online. And eventually somebody finally said, Max, if you would just go somewhere and do a little learning first, you could stop asking some of these stupid questions. And they referred me to the w3c.org and told me to go over there. And I did. I learned it one piece at a time, like the old Johnny Cash song.
Yep.
And could eventually do just enough to make the website run, and where people could come and look at stuff to buy and send me an email or call me to ask about buying it. But after I built the website, then it was like, people said I needed a blog. So I started to blog. A little later on, this mall in Georgia had been trying to sell a carousel for over a year with no luck. And I said, how about y'all record a little video of that carousel running and send it to me? And they did, and we sold the carousel in less than a month.
Wow.
And so I thought, well, if videos can sell carousels, maybe videos could sell Macs. So I started recording videos for my website using the camera that was on my computer with just bargain basement headphones from Walmart. But I knew that there had to be a way for me to focus the camera so I would be on screen. So I found a friend of mine who got online with me on Skype, because back then Skype was where everybody was. And she helped me figure out the angle of the lid of the laptop so I'd know where to put it if I was sitting up straight, or where to put it if I was reclining. And so I started recording videos. But I needed an intro, which is, I mentioned earlier that the first time I sang in public was to record some music to begin that first video of stuff to promote amusement equipment. Mm-hmm. And then, later on, the blog, later on social media came along. I had to learn how to use Facebook and Twitter and, Pinterest was the big thing then.
Sure. Yeah, I remember that.
So it's been one small to medium thing after another. And each time I've figured out that, I can either do this or I can learn how to do it, or I can maybe find somebody who will do it for me, at least for now, and just continue to keep moving. And after I did that for a while, and then the blind blogger thing, on my first book, a woman actually dared me to write a book for a virtual summit. And that's how I started writing my first book, Leading You Out of the Darkness into the Light, A Blind Man's Inspirational Guide to Success. So
nice title, by the way.
Yeah, I have to credit my editor for it. I didn't come up with the artwork or the title. I just created the manuscript, and she turned the manuscript into a book. And wonderful woman, Lorraine Reguly at wordingwell.com, who I actually met because she reached out to offer to solve a problem with my blog at the time. For some reason, the images were showing up in the middle of text instead of off to the side of the text. And as you know, as a webmaster, people don't have patience for stuff like that. So I was losing a lot of traffic. And she reached out to help me figure out it was a setting in
That's wonderful.
Yeah, it was a setting in the third-party app I was using to create my blog posts. So when I was at that point of having a book but not knowing how to publish it, she came along and we released the book. And like I said, now I've done 3 other books, and I've contributed to a couple of collaborative books, and still hoping to finish that next book that finishes my travel series that I started in 2016. However, I've been spending a lot of time lately writing for other people's websites, which has been enjoyable. Public speaking was one of those things. I did a podcast interview with a host who invited me to come speak at his event. It didn't work out that year, but it worked out the next year. And then it was one of those things. I decided that there had to be some way for me to get from here to there with my budget. So I managed to come up with enough money to take the train from Houston to Philadelphia. And there was 7 or 8 other speakers that every single one of them commented on how impressed they were that somebody would travel by themselves from Houston to Philadelphia over 1,500 miles away. And I just never really thought nothing of it. I just thought, it was part of what I had to do, and so I was going to do it.
Yeah, sure.
And that's also been kind of a theme in my experiences. But, every time I have done something, it usually started with a little bit, and then the challenges got bigger and bigger. And then quite often, a different direction might show up. And, the whole thing about accessibility is kind of weird, because this is the first time in my life, or at least in the last 15 years, this first time that I have been focused on just one thing. I haven't been thinking, okay, there's several things I'm good at. Let's just keep doing them all at the same time until we find out which one of them will pay the bills. Which one of them will make me money all by itself. So I had been doing, booking people on podcasts. I had been doing coaching. I had been booking paid speaking. I had been hiring to help people start podcasts. So I've still occasionally helped somebody sell a piece of amusement equipment. But all these things that I have learned to be good at because I had to, none of them were really working out for me. And it's kind of like, each time I tried something new, I would do it for a while and I would think, okay, when is this finally going to be successful? And it never did. I personally feel that one of the reasons why it never did is I never picked one thing and just decided, okay, this is what we're going to do. And I can't claim 100% credit for accessibility as far as this is the thing I'm going to be doing, because I mentioned Alex earlier. He was the one who asked me to work on Podmatch. I didn't ask him. And a year and a half ago, when the people at Audio Eye reached out to me about writing for their website, I actually turned them down. I tried to talk them out of hiring me because, yes, I ended up having to have 4 interviews before I actually got signed to a contract with them. And at every interview, we laughed about this. So what happened was I connected with one of their folks on LinkedIn. I sent a short thank you note. they replied saying, Max, we're really impressed with all the things you're doing. We might have a job for you. Here's the link. Would you go check it out? So I went and checked out the link, and I said, about half of this job I would be perfect for. But the other half, the part that involves using Microsoft products like Excel and Word and having to use Adobe and some of these other products you want somebody to use, there's no way I can do that. I said, but I would like to be a resource to the eventual hire on a contract basis. So I appreciate if you keep me in mind for that. And they said, Mr. Ivey, we think that would work, but the way we do things is we have to have you in our system before we can do any type of work with you. So would you please fill out the job application and send it in with your resume? So I filled it out on LinkedIn, which one of the things I love about LinkedIn is the ability to do an easy apply, or where all you have to do is add your resume and it grabs all your other information and sends it along to them. I love being able to do that on a job application. I sent it to them, and 30 minutes later, I got an email. It said, Mr. Ivey, we appreciate you being interested in our position, but you're not qualified for it.
Oh, my God.
To which I replied, I already told y'all I wasn't qualified for it. This stuff happens to me all the time. So
that's crazy.
I have friends who call me the blind Kramer from Seinfeld because always this seems to come into my life, So yeah, I ended up having, I had that, I explained, they would ask me about, how I got in contact with them. So I would tell that every time I talk to somebody, including the COO of the company. And, did eventually take a job where I write for them. I also do website reviews and, social media postings for them. One of those, weird things in life that shows you just how small the world is. It turns out the COO of AudioEye.com comes from a family of carnival game operators from Michigan and Ohio. Yeah,
wow.
Yeah, his family. But see, my family, we were small time. We were 7 or 8 rides. His family, they are big time. Their family owns single game trailers that are worth more than I ever earned in my life. So
wow.
But then, in today's carnival world, a game trailer can start at $150,000 and go up.
Yeah, I'm not surprised.
So, yeah. But like I say, I tried to talk them out of it. They persuaded me. I took the work, and then I thought, well, are they even going to like my writing style? Because I'm not a technical writer. I'm a storyteller.
Which is the best kind, by the way.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate it. But it took me a long time to accept, one, that I am a storyteller, and one, that I'm a good storyteller. I grew up around my dad, who was a storyteller for profit. I call myself a storyteller for entertainment because when he told stories, he was telling them to festival committees and law enforcement officials. When I tell stories, I'm telling them to people for their entertainment,
Right.
When he told stories, it was the difference between working and maybe not eating that week. When I tell them, so like I say, I wasn't sure they would like my style, but because I am a storyteller, but apparently combining my experiences and using my abilities as a storyteller along with the information about accessibility as it applies to things like, website forms and search engines, podcasting, in-person presentations, and a lot of other topics was exactly what they wanted. I mean, they love my storytelling, although, as we go along and as, their team changes, I'm finding less and less of my stories making it into the final cuts of my articles, but some of it is still there. And thankfully, I get to write for a couple other places where, I'm still getting to do more storytelling, and I get to do podcast interviews or conversations like we're having today where I get to tell stories. And one thing I would advise everybody out there is one of the reasons why I have managed to accumulate a following, why people like me and want to help me and want to do business with me is because I am 100% authentic. Sometimes to my detriment.
Well, that's part of being authentic. I mean, because none of us are perfect human beings. So, I mean, of course it's going to be sometimes to the detriment. You just have to be ready for that.
Oh yeah. I've had several coaching exploratory calls as the potential client where I was told, Max, I know your brand is authenticity, but could you be a little less authentic?
Really? They actually said that?
They actually said that more than
Oh my
once.
goodness.
More than once, yes. So,
wow. That's really something.
but we live in an age where authentic storytelling for business is very powerful
It is.
if you can find the courage to do it. And of course, it's one of those things. I didn't start being able to tell the stories the way I tell them now. So, don't feel bad about yourself if you hold some stuff back the first few times. One of the great things about podcasting or about guest blog post writing is you get practice in telling your stories. And the more practice you get at it, the more comfortable you become at it, the more details you will include, even if some of those details may not be glowing to your reputation, but they create the idea that you're a real live human being in the minds of the other people. And so I've been blessed that, like I say, right now is a good time for storytellers. It's a great time for authenticity. I find business people really struggle with storytelling because they're scared to death that if they say the wrong thing or don't put their experiences in the absolute best light possible, it's going to cost them work. And
very common.
Very common. They are very hard to convince that they need to be more open. And the truth of the matter is and I've discovered this, it applies to public speaking, it applies to singing, it applies to being a business owner. The thing that you're doing that is challenging to you, there are thousands, if not millions of people who would like to do it, but who are never going to do it. And so they will be impressed or at least curious, entertained. They will look at you and think you're doing something that they're not capable of. Yeah. And so a lot of times, even if your story, has some negatives in it, you're still going to come off really good in the audience because they're going to be thinking, wow, he's done some stuff I won't do. And
I totally agree.
So I put myself out there. I sing songs that don't have instrumentals to them. I tell stories from the stage that people laugh at. And sometimes when I get down into the audience afterwards, they ask me what I was thinking, but at the same time, I have had people come up to me and go, Max, this thing you talk about of interdependence where you ask for help and let people help you, I've never heard that before, especially not in the disability community. And I had a woman come up to me back in June at a conference. I was speaking at the Wyoming Developmental Disabilities Conference, which, by the way, was weird being the only blind person at a conference for people with disabilities. But
you're right. There's something kind of odd about that. You would think there would be better representation.
Well, I figured there would at least be some people with multiple disabilities who had a developmental disability as well as vision loss or hearing loss or something, but I never found them if they did. So,
wow.
But I had a woman come up to me. She said, Max, I was sitting there listening to you talk about interdependence. She said, I had to Google the word. I've never heard it before.
Really? Interesting.
Yes. Wow. Yeah. And of course, it's very foreign to the disability community because we spend all our time talking about being independent, talking about finding ways to do things without assistance from other people. So it's the idea that.
All right, let's stop right there and let's work with that a bit because obviously most of my listeners are going to be sighted or not going to be dealing with some sort of impairment. Don't necessarily know on a day-to-day basis what it's like. We can kind of sort of imagine what it might be like to not have eyesight, but we're kind of too scared to even go there, so we don't spend a lot of time on that.
Exactly.
So let's just talk for a minute about what the day-to-day experience for you is like online, and also, as you were inferring a moment ago, what it's like to be working within a community of people who also have impairments who are dealing with how they deal with it, and they're sharing their experiences. Talk about those two pieces.
Right. Well, the one thing when it comes to dealing with other people who have disabilities, and this is something I've really been working at this because one of the things I believe holds the disability community back the most is our lack of communication across disabilities.
Okay.
There may be a quote disability community, but I don't personally believe it exists because for the most part, people with vision loss do not campaign for hearing loss issues or issues concerning paraplegics or quadriplegics for the most part. And so one of the things I really try to do is educate myself on the challenges of people with other disabilities. And for example, I'm up there at the mic giving my talk And in a room full of people, many of whom have developmental disabilities, it is not uncommon for people to just, blurt out their thoughts or opinions while you're talking. And as a public speaker, the first time that happens is very disconcerting. So it's one of those things you have to get used to. I'm getting used to the fact that you have full-grown physical adults who are living with mental acuities much less than what we would consider adult. Being around people who have multiple disabilities, like somebody who has cerebral palsy and is also in a wheelchair, or a friend of mine I recently met who is visually impaired and also in a wheelchair. Those are some challenges far beyond what I know. So I spend a lot of my time trying to listen to other people and learn about their disabilities and their challenges. And, in person, the physical world, the challenges are much different because naturally a person who's blind doesn't have the same challenges as a person dealing with a wheelchair, especially when it comes to navigating a parking lot, a building structure, etc. Now, they may be able to navigate it better once they get inside because they can read the signs.
Sure.
But if the walkway or the aisle isn't 42 inches or wider, then they're going to struggle with just getting in the building or moving around inside the building. So
right.
I try to educate myself on other people's challenges. I try to build relationships with people from the other disability groups and learn from them. Like one of the things I learned from my hearing impaired friend at Audio Eye is when she drives, she has stickers on her car that let police officers know that she is hearing impaired because once upon a time, she almost ended up in a very negative situation with a police officer because they did not know she was deaf and they could not communicate with each other.
I can see where that would be a problem too. Yeah. Especially if the officer isn't aware of it because he thinks that she's, basically being defiant because she's not giving him the information he's looking for.
Exactly. It happens more often with people who have mental disabilities or mental disorders. But to me, mental disabilities are just as much a part of the disability community as anything else. And I also like to include people who have chronic illnesses because those chronic illnesses act on that person's life as if it is a disability. I mean, their lives are just as affected, even if it's a chronic illness as opposed to something that's been classified as a disability before now. So, living the lives each day. And I think one of the best things we can do, and of course this is difficult because of geography, but it's really cool when you have the opportunity to cooperate with other people who have disabilities so that you can all enjoy a situation better. I spoke at an event in Pennsylvania in 2020, I think it was. It was organized by a friend of mine named Amy Bovard, who's an author who happens to be visually impaired, and she writes about orientation and mobility training and cane navigation. It was the first event I ever went to where the speaker lineup included visually impaired, hearing impaired. There was a speaker who was deafblind. There were two speakers who were autistic. There was a quadriplegic. We had 7 or 8 speakers, and just about every one of them represented a different disability group that could share with that audience from a different level of life experiences. So that to me is the area as far as dealing with and working with other people with disabilities. And of course, the final part of that is quite often when we show up at an event or a location, it's kind of weird because usually we are the only ones there. It's to me, and this may sound kind of backwards, I have a harder time being at an event or in a location where there are multiple people with disabilities than I have being the only one in the room.
Really?
And I think it's because it's what I'm used to. I'm used to being the only. I mean, the reason people call me the blind blogger is because in 2009 or 10 or 11, I was the only person those people knew who was visually impaired and who was a blogger.
Okay.
In spite of the fact that even then there were thousands of people creating content. I like to tell people I am not the most talented writer. I'm not the most consistent or most prolific. I'm just shameless in promoting my work, which is something most of the rest of them weren't doing. So
okay, that's cool.
That's how I became the blind blogger. I was the blind guy blogging in a group of bloggers, and so it's not unusual to be the only one at an event or location, or even an online event. it's kind of weird for me whenever I'm in a place where there's a whole bunch of us in one place. And the more varied the disabilities are, the more uncomfortable I am in the beginning, and the more I have to work at it personally to become comfortable and to be Max, because, I'm a friendly, affable person who makes friends out of strangers everywhere I go. And so it really just wouldn't be me to be uncomfortable. But in the first few minutes or hours at a place where there's a whole bunch of other disabled people, I'm usually kind of like, what's that old expression about a cat, like in a room full of rocking chairs? That's how I sometimes feel, and I tell you, you go into a room full of people with white canes and guide dogs, it can get just navigating a hallway can get interesting.
Yeah, I can imagine. Yeah, that's true. Let me ask you a more specific, direct question too. Just from the perspective of somebody who does deal with visual impairment, how accessible is the web? I mean, not just the web, also how accessible is social media? Because that's a big part of our lives today too.
Right. Okay. I'm gonna give you a statistic. I don't know if I'm going to qualify it once I give it to you, because I have some opinions on the statistic. But
okay,
the people at Audio Eye have done research, and they've looked through other people's research, and they've found that somewhere around 4% of the web is considered to be 100% accessible.
Which is pretty low, but not terribly surprising to me.
That's hideously low. It gets even worse when you think about it this way. Okay. We have had the National Rehabilitation Act for over 50 years.
Mm.
We've had Title IV, I think it is, for education of people with disabilities for 40 or 50 years. We have had the Americans with Disabilities Act for over 30 years.
Mm-hmm.
We've had hundreds of lawsuits on the state, national, and international levels. We've done so much in the area of compliance, in the area of advocating for political change and new regulations, and yet we're still at 4%.
Mm.
Now, to me, that means that we're probably not putting our time in the right places. I personally believe that we spend a whole lot of effort on compliance, legal threats, and shame, but we don't spend enough effort on education, communication, and collaboration. We talk too much about the hows and not enough about the whys.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I hear you on that. Do those same numbers apply to the social media apps as well? Facebook, Twitter, all that kind of stuff?
All right. Here's the thing about social media, and this is just my opinion, but I think it's fairly accurate. Social media is not more or less accessible. The problem with social media is that it's constantly being updated, and every time it is updated, you can experience challenges with your adaptive technology based on what they updated and how they changed it. And the other thing is those are websites where, millions of people are adding their own personal content to those sites on sometimes a minute by minute basis. And since you can't control all the contributors to a site like Facebook or Twitter or Instagram is naturally going to be less accessible, just because most times accessibility is built in by the web developer, by the coders. And in this case, most of the content is being added by the user. So
mm-hmm.
there's a limit to what they can do in the area of accessibility. Now, they could put things in place that would encourage users to add the alternative text tags. Like, for example, on Facebook right now, you have to click a button and decide you want to add them. Whereas on WordPress websites, as a site owner, it will always prompt me that I have left out the alternative text tags, which for people who don't know about that yet, it's basically where the text you describe what the image would look like if you were looking at it, and then you add that to the code of the website. And then with people like me who are using screen readers, they get to that image, it will tell us whatever you wrote about the image. And most people don't do that on social media, and the ones who do add alt text on social media, they tend to fall in two groups. They either are the group I love, which is they will paint me a picture with words to where I feel like I could, close my eyes and see it in my mind. I love those people. But then there's the other probably 2/3 or 3/4 that are just going to say, this is a picture of me with flowers, or this is a picture of a plate of food. The descriptions are so scanty that there might as well not be there at all in a lot of cases. but that's social media. And then, of course, I did mention that updates are a problem. When you're using adaptive technology, every time something updates, you have to relearn how to navigate a particular site to get to the things you need.
Sure,
So I strongly recommend to site owners, look, if you're going to change something, make sure it's something you really need to change that actually affects the user experience and isn't just being done for cosmetic purposes or to justify your paycheck as the developer. And if you are going to make changes, post some sort of notice and let people know that a change is coming and what the change is going to be and when it will take effect, so that people like me can go, okay, they're going to change the URL structure from dashes to slashes or from slashes to underscores. And then the next time I visit the website, I know, okay, all I have to do is go and replace my dashes with whatever. And then I don't have to go back to the home page of the website and re-navigate all my bookmarks and history.
Right. Yeah. That does make a huge difference.
Yeah.
Right.
And it's one of those things most people don't think about. Most people will,
Right.
I personally don't believe people avoid accessibility out of malice. I think most people either just don't understand, don't think about it, or don't know how to implement it. But in many cases, it's little things like that that can make my life miserable. I remember last year, I'm not as big a Twitter user as I used to be, but I remember like 6 months to a year ago when Twitter moved the @ and the hashtag off of the main screen of their smartphone app. So when I use it on my iPhone, I now have to first press the button for the numbers section and then press the @ or the hashtag and then press the letters section and then type my string of text for my @ symbol or my hashtag. And then I can finish writing my post. But if I have multiple hashtags or I want to tag multiple people on a Twitter post, whatever they're calling it these days, that just made my life incredibly much harder by them just changing a couple of things that I'm sure they thought were no big deal.
Yeah. And I understand that mentality, because even though I understand this, I am 100% certain that my site is not accessible, or, well, it's minimally accessible at best, but I certainly haven't given it that kind of attention. I understand how that can just kind of slip through. You just don't pay any attention to it.
Yeah. But I want to go back to your specific question about website accessibility. I don't think we can ever get to 100% or even 95%, maybe not even to 90%. And that's because when it comes to developing a website, and you know this as somebody who used to build them, a website is not a static thing. It is not a statue you create and then it never changes. Websites are fluid. They are constantly being improved, added to. You're constantly having to change them based on changing best practices, on newer technology. Sometimes the technology you built on is no longer available. Right. So with a website, I'm glad to see that more people in the disability community are starting to talk about progress over perfect.
Good.
I also like to talk about how it should be sincere effort as opposed to arbitrary rules, because the arbitrary rules only get you so far. And so when it comes to your website, my website is 100% accessible. And I have an idea as to some of the reasons why. And some of the reasons why have to do with people that I'm just now recently learning about. I did not know until recently, and I can admit this because honesty is part of my brand. I did not know until recently that people with dyslexia can highly benefit from having a multitude of color choices for your background and your foreground text.
Interesting. I didn't know that either.
No, I did not realize that it can make a huge difference in how well they're able to read and comprehend the information on your website if they can change the colors for the back or the text. And now I know about this for the visually impaired. I know a lot of people that use screen magnification. They like to flip the colors and have a white text or yellow text on a black background or other light text on dark background. I know about that, but I did not know about dyslexia. So it's a case where I'm, still teaching myself. And so with a website, when you add new content, so if you add a video, it would be great if you could add captions or transcript or both. The great thing about captions nowadays is, like, for example, if you upload a video to YouTube now, it will add captions to your video for you. But you will have to go in and edit the captions, because just like anything else that's automated, like automated transcriptions, it will get some stuff wrong. And
Right.
in fact, when I posted the video of me singing my latest song on YouTube, my hearing impaired friend reached out to me and said, Max, I'm going to have to teach you how to edit the closed captionings on your video because yours needs work. I'm like, and I told her, I said, that's cool. I said, can you help me with something else? And she said, what? I said, well, I've been told that allowing YouTube to choose your thumbnail image for your video is like the absolute best way to get the absolute worst image possible. So can you help me figure out how to choose the thumbnail images for our YouTube videos? I said, that'd be really cool. But closed captioning, another thing is, and you probably didn't realize this because it would be on the other side of the recording. When we started recording, StreamYard prompted me. It said, I can press a button for automated live transcription or closed captioning of our conversation. So if you have somebody who joins you on this video who has hearing issues, they can press that button and the computer will do its best to caption what it is you are saying to help them understand and follow along during your conversation. I wasn't sure if you were aware of that or not.
I wasn't. No, that's very cool. I'm glad that you told me about that.
Yeah. Zoom has that. Google Meet has it. Most of the really big dog meeting programs nowadays have that option built into them. I think Zoom did it first, but I'm not 100% sure.
Probably, yeah.
Zoom has proven itself to be one of the most accessible platforms of any on the internet. And so that's why I would assume they did it first, but I'm sure one of your listeners will correct me if I am wrong. So, but you know, those are the kind of things when you post a video, the captions and transcriptions, when you post, and this is something I've been talking to podcasters a lot about lately is audio descriptions. Now, for people who don't know what that is, if you're visually impaired and you have a proper kind of television or cable provider or dish provider, there's an option of turning on what's called audio described television or audio descriptions. It's usually broadcast on the secondary audio channel or the SAP on your TV, but it's available on a lot of video as well. I think it's available on pretty much all of the Disney streaming stuff, and it's available on Amazon and most of the others as well, but only directly from their streaming service. If you try to use any of the streaming services with a Roku or Apple TV or one of the other TV players like that, you lose access to the audio descriptions, and that's one of those hardware things that apparently it's a dispute between the streaming companies and the television, type streaming hardware people. Yeah. That they, for some reason, audio descriptions have been disabled in Roku and Apple TV from the streaming services, but they're still there. If I go play a TV show on my phone using the app directly from the streaming source, then I get the audio descriptions. But I got off track there. I'm sorry about that. What happens is there are actors or voiceover actors who will narrate the action on screen whenever people aren't talking. Mm-hmm. And that allows people who are visually impaired to have a more immersive experience in the television, movies, and even certain live programs. Like last year's Academy Awards were audio described in real time, which doesn't happen often for live television. So what I've been having fun with lately is talking to podcast hosts about how, while they may record in video because video allows you to have a more personal conversation, the idea of eye contact and looking people in the face and that sort of stuff. Sure. But most of us, I would say probably 75 to 85% of our content consumption is being done in audio. So if you think about it, the people you're recording for are blind. And since they're blind, why not take a little advice from a guy who pretty much lives with audio his entire life? So what I have been encouraging podcast hosts to do is do an audio description yourself, your background. When you start, encourage your guests to do an audio description. If at some point in your episode something happens that is recorded on video that will go out on video that was important, like a head shake, or like a few days ago when I stuck my tongue out at a host for some reason that I forget now, or one of the members of the recording is especially affected by something that was said, and you can only really tell that by the expressions on their face. Have those things described for your audience. And so what you're doing is you're creating a more immersive audio experience for your listeners. And that's the whole thing. If you're wanting to build a loyal following that is going to listen to your episodes, subscribe, download, tell other people to come listen, you want to build that connection with your audience. And by having visual elements in your audio files that aren't described, you're really missing an opportunity to make that connection with your listeners. So I've been encouraging podcast hosts to start doing audio descriptions. I also encourage them to think about their background if the background changes for some specific reason. I also think it's really important to describe our pets if our pets are going to be part of the show. If they routinely make an appearance, then the listeners should have an idea of what that cat, dog, ferret, bunny rabbit, whatever looks like. You're building a connection,
Yeah, it makes total sense to me. I totally get what you're saying. I think you're right. We actually have blown through our hour and I want to bring it to a close. But before I do that, I want to get a couple of pieces of information from you. First of all, somebody who, perhaps it's a web developer, perhaps it's somebody who has their own entrepreneurial project and they're thinking, I really need to bring accessibility into it. They want to reach out to you. They want to get get some information, maybe pick your brain about something. How do they reach you?
Right. Well, they can go to my new website, theaccessibilityadvantage.com. And I will tell you right now, it's not very accessible, but it's brand new, and we're in the process of moving other site stuff over there. And in the first of the year, it's going to be the home of the Accessibility Advantage podcast. So I hope y'all will visit theaccessibilityadvantage.com and bookmark the page. And it has my email address on there as well as my scheduling link if you want to book some time to, as you said, pick my brain. I've never been one of those people who likes to make it hard for people to contact me. I don't want y'all to think that you have to be ready to buy something from me or book me or hire me in order to talk to me, because quite often the best things happen when you have conversations with people without a specific agenda, which may be counterintuitive to my business friends out there, but it's been working for me for a long time. So my email address, my scheduling link are both on the website. Feel free to reach out to me there. We talked before we got started. One of the things that I'm doing, and I'm going to keep doing it until I get overwhelmed, which hasn't happened yet. So more people need to take me up on this, is offering to review people's homepage. I'll check out your primary website homepage, and I'll do that for no cost and no obligation. I want to have conversations about accessibility. And if your website is, say 75, 85%, I would love to relieve people's fears. I think that's another area where a lot of people would take steps in the area of accessibility if it weren't for the fear and the overwhelm. If it wasn't for thinking, okay, where do I even start? What is the most important thing I need to do? What is the worst things that I can do? How do I even deal with all the various disabilities and the various technologies that they will use? And there are some basic things that you can apply that will help with pretty much any person's disability when it comes to online. And I'll go ahead and share just one with y'all right now because I think this is a very important one. One of the best ways to avoid problems with websites and apps is design from the point of view of a keyboard instead of a mouse. In a lot of cases, adaptive technology users either don't have access to the mouse or they have only unreliable, sporadic access to the mouse. And so one of the ways you can design from the beginning that will be more accessible for your people with disabilities, as well as make your website more enjoyable for everybody else who visits, is designed from the point of view of a keyboard instead of a mouse or a swipe.
Yeah, I think that's good advice. I like that. And thank you for that contact information as well. I'll make sure that we'll include a link in the show notes to make it easier to find what's the name of the podcast too? Because is it the same as the website? Is it the Accessibility Advantage?
Yes, for once I've actually thought about my branding before starting something, and because in the past my thing has been, okay, this is an idea I want to do, and let's just go ahead and start doing some of the things that we need to do today. And so this is the first, I mentioned earlier about how accessibility is something that I'm really focused on for the first time in my online career being focused on one thing at one time. The other thing I've never done before is I've never really planned out something before starting it. And this has been going on for at least 4, maybe 5 months, going back to when I realized that my future was going to be in accessibility, then to thinking, okay, how do we handle the podcast? How do we handle the web, the blog, the existing branding? What do we do? And we haven't come up with a perfect answer, but in the short time, what we're doing is we're pausing new episodes of What's Your Excuse, but we're keeping them out there because there's a lot of very great inspirational content in them. And we're going to gradually move the content that's appropriate over to the accessibilityadvantage.com and build the site from there. So but you know, the idea that I've recorded one episode and I've recorded the trailer for the podcast, but usually by now in my journey, I'd already have 3 months worth of shows.
So, I hear you completely. Yeah.
But I appreciate
One last thing I want to do before we finish with it.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Oh yeah. No, we appreciate you being here. And no, that's right. This is something I started doing about, almost 2 years ago now, but I realized, and this is really going to apply to you. Boy, this is going to apply to you in a big way. It applies to all of my guests, but it's really going to apply to you. You know, people who come onto the show are people who are givers. That's why they do what they do. They like to give. They like to help. They've been through their own crap. And they came through the other side and they want to help other people get to the other side as well. So they're constantly giving. They're creating content. They're doing the podcasts. They're blogging. They're going onto social media. They're sharing all this information very often with people that they've never met, never seen, never will meet, never will see. Just they don't know who they are. They don't see what the result is. And they don't get credit for it. And I say, whoa, wait a minute. We should be getting credit for that. So on behalf of those people you've never met, you've never seen, never will meet, never will see, who have been consuming your content, picking up your ideas, listening to you on the podcast, reading your blog and so on, and you've been helping them in ways you don't know about. On their behalf, thank you for what you've been doing, because you've been making a big difference in this world.
Well, I appreciate it, and I really appreciate your time. And I know we have gone long, but there's one thing that I like to share pretty much anytime I sit down and record, because I feel it's really important to people regardless of what they are doing in their lives. And that is we are not intended to do difficult, challenging things by ourselves. And when we invite other people or allow other people to be part of our journey, it becomes easier. So I love to share this expression that will help them take the focus off of themselves and put it on the other person, and hopefully find the freedom to ask for the help or ask for the opportunities that they need in order to become the person that they know they are. And this is how it goes. I tell people that when you refuse to ask, you rob the other person of the joy they would have received.
Ooh, I like that. That's very cool.
Yes. When you refuse to ask for help, when you refuse to ask for opportunities, you rob the other person of the joy they would have received.
Really good. What a great way to wrap up the show, too. Wow.
Thank you.
So, Max, thank you. Really appreciate you being here. I've enjoyed this thoroughly. And, man, you've given us so much good stuff to think about. So thank you again for being here on the show.
All right. Well, maybe a year or two from now, I can come back and share some of the self-help stuff that helped me get this far.
There you go. Sounds like a good idea. Sounds like a plan. So thank you very much. Thank you to our podcast listeners everywhere. We will see you all next time here on LOA Today. Goodbye, everybody.